Hi, this is Dr. Frank with the Church of Rational Truth. Today, our Sunday lecture is on the empathy greed spectrum. This is something that I often bring up with my patients who come in to talk about their problems, what's going on, their relationships. And basically, I like to explain empathy and greed as a spectrum, as a continuum from empathy being on one side all the way to the other side, which is completely greedy. And I usually say most people fall somewhere on the spectrum. It's not hard and fast. It's not like you're, there forever on one side, but you can kind of see this as a way of understanding how much someone will give or how much someone is willing to take in general. Uh, the good thing about this is it's a nice way of having people understand how much greed or empathy they should have and whether they're too far one way or another on the spectrum and how it actually applies to them and how it's affecting their lives. Usually, I have this conversation with people who are way too far on the empathetic side. And the reason I say way too far, even though generally we don't usually say what's right and wrong, or we don't usually like to, put many hard stances, because it's a spectrum we probably clearly have going too far on either sides. And I see people who are too far on the empathetic side all the time. The reason is those people are people who are actually more willing to come in and admit they have a problem, or they're more willing to come in because of the consequences of their problem. Because usually, the problem with someone who's overly empathetic, they see the problem, it affects them negatively, versus the person who's on the greed side of that spectrum, they usually don't see the problem. If anything, they're getting the benefit of it. Very rarely do they start seeing the problem, and many times they usually blame the problem on someone else, or the problem is not being able to be greedy enough. But because they get some benefit out of doing it, they usually don't come in because they complain that I'm too greedy or I'm taking too much from other people. But the person who's empathetic usually comes in, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I have nothing, I've given away everything, I've got this big life issue. And they're the more likely person to come in and actually talk about their problems, even though both sides of the spectrum can be an issue or can cause problems in people's lives. So, usually, when I have someone who's overly empathetic, I usually bring up the question, could you, if you had the ability to wave a magic wand and get rid of all greed in the world, would you do it? And most of them will say, absolutely, I'll get rid of all greed. We'll all not be greedy, and then everybody will be happy. The problem with that is that we do need a certain amount of greed. Greed is not necessarily bad, it is not this horrible evil that people say. It's not this mortal sin that if you're in the least bit greedy, oh gosh, the world's going to end. Greed keeps us alive. Greed makes sure our needs are taken care of. If I eat, if I do those things, it keeps me healthy. It keeps me alive. It keeps me happy. Greed. That's why people are greedy. They get a benefit from it. They get a personal benefit from it. The problem is when you go too far with it, when you take from others, when you take excessively, when you hurt others to take, that's when you start going too far on the greed spectrum. But they completely ignore that they can go too far on the empathetic spectrum. So when someone neglects their own needs, when someone is not taking for themselves, when they're giving more than they can afford to give, that's when they've gone too far on the empathetic spectrum. And I usually tell people, you've got to find the balance. You've got to find some middle ground. There's not necessarily a magic, oh, this is the perfect amount, but I usually say the rough amount is, take what you need to get your own needs and then help others. It's kind of like an airplane when you need oxygen, fix your oxygen for yourself, and then once you have oxygen, get the oxygen for the person next to you who's struggling. And that's a nice, simple way of kind of telling, okay, am I doing too much or not enough in the greed spectrum? Both sides, though, will have problems, and there is a point on both sides where you will start getting more and more problems, or it becomes more and more unethical, or more that it's going to affect you. This is also where you'll see narcissism. I would say most people who are on the narcissistic side are just on the extreme of greed. They take, 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 but narcissism has some added flair to it, and mostly the big problem is not seeing their own flaws or faults. That's another reason why those people who are far on the greed side don't usually come in, because if you come in to a doctor, you come into someone to talk about your problems, you're admitting you have a problem. And with narcissists, they see themselves as perfect, they see themselves without problems. So they're very, very unlikely to come in unless their world is absolutely in shambles. So, what I would say for most people is assessing yourself, saying, hey, whereabouts am I on the spectrum? Should I be shifting? Should I be changing certain decisions to make myself be in a more happy medium? Am I giving too much where it's really affecting me negatively? Or am I taking too much and I'm really hurting others? Both sides can be too far. Um, but oh gosh, I had a point for the empathetic side and I just forgot it. But either way, try to be real with yourself. Try to determine, when is it too much, when is it not enough, and then hopefully find a nice middle ground of appropriateness where the maximum good is done, or at least you can appropriately be greedy and appropriately be empathetic, so that you can get the best of both worlds. I think that's it for today's lecture. We'll come back next week where I believe, we'll be doing a financial update and another Sunday lecture. Once again, this is Dr. Frank for the Church of Rational Truth signing off. Bye bye.